There's a lot going on in Mark chapter 14, and I looked at it for a while. Early on, I guess back in December, when I kind of mapped out what we were going to do going through Mark, I will admit, early on, I just put Mark 14 here. And then somewhere along the way, I came up with a title of kind of what I thought the flow of it would be, but I still wasn't 100% sure which story to pick and which one not to. So what we're going to kind of do is survey most of it. And we'll read a little bit here and there, but we'll kind of walk our way through. Because like some of the other chapters we looked at in Mark, I feel like a lot of things interrelate, and we could pick one and just go into depth with it, or we can kind of look at it as a whole, and I decided to go that route. So as we look at Mark 14, I think we'll see some themes going through there that hopefully we can learn from this morning. Beginning in verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." So sometimes these things of setting we'll just kind of skip by to get to the main part of the story, and this almost feels like an aside here at the beginning. But I want you to consider for a moment the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, because we don't put a whole lot of weight on all of these feasts nowadays other than this one that we do every week. Although even in the way that we do it, it's a lot less feast and a lot more remembrance nowadays, because it's kind of not what you think of in terms of feast. But in Bible days, there were all these different feasts throughout the year that would remind people of different things. And the Feast of the Unleavened Bread came about way back in Exodus chapter 12. It says, "You shall observe the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever." So this feast is set up for the purpose of remembering their deliverance from slavery. God's people live this life throughout the book of Genesis, where things begin in the garden and things are going well. And as David talked about in class today, things very quickly started not going well. And then things are up and down with the family of Noah, and then later on with God's people all throughout the book. We get to the end of the book of Genesis, and Joseph has rescued everybody from this famine through the power of God. And then very quickly, Egypt forgets what Joseph has done, even though he was second in command there. And over the course of some generations, his people become slaves. And then God brings Moses along to bring his people out of slavery. And the reason why they used unleavened bread was to remind them of the speed kind of what was happening. They didn't have time for the bread to rise as they escaped Egypt. They had to go, and this was the way that they would remember. And so this Feast of Unleavened Bread is supposed to be all about deliverance. It's supposed to be this time to remember. And isn't it like people, when we have these moments where we are to remember something, how quickly we forget what it's all about and how quickly we turn in other directions? It says in Galatians chapter 5, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." So this feast that was something that was intended to remember this freedom from slavery they had, now as Jesus is coming along, they're using this time to remember their deliverance to instead plot the murder of their deliverer. They don't realize that this is the one who is going to deliver them from sin that's there in their midst. And instead, as they're supposed to be thinking so much on deliverance, they just can't see it right in front of their eyes. And isn't that too like people? So often God is doing things, and we're waiting for that moment where God is supposed to show up and do something, and he's been doing something all along. And here God working his plan in a masterful way, and they just can't see it. Instead of focusing in on God and what he has done, which is the whole design of that feast, they're instead focusing in on their fears and the loss of their power and their confusion, and they're going in their own direction. And we learn through this something we learn throughout Scripture. I like the NIV wording here in Romans 8. We know that in all things God works. God is working even in the midst of their plan. And it seems like it would be the last place God would be working. Everything seems evil and wrong and moving in the wrong direction and moving against God, and yet God is working even in this plan. And so we see God working through a plan that he set in motion 1,500 years earlier. We could argue about the date, by the way, but the Exodus is happening roughly 1,500 years, what we read there in Exodus 12, 1,500 years before the time where everything is happening during this last week of the life of Jesus. And so although God had this plan in mind from before time, and if you weren't here on Wednesday, we talked about that, he set it in motion there with that Feast of Unleavened Bread in Exodus 12. And this plan has been moving from generation to generation to generation to the point that it seems like people are working against God. And I believe this is one of the first places here that we can really take comfort in this chapter, as it seems like so many bad things happen in Mark 14. To remember that when things seem like they are not going the direction we would like them to go, God is still at work. We shouldn't be standing around waiting for everything seems so ungodly in our world that when is God going to show up and fix this? God is still at work. Everything seems like it's moving in the opposite direction. It's harder to be a Christian than it ever has been, it seems like, in our country. God is still at work. And here, as the crowd is trying to move against Jesus and plotting for his death, even in the death of Jesus, God is still at work. So while he was at Bethany, verse 3, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. So there's this moment here of extravagant love. And I will have to admit to you, you hear this story if you grow up in church. You probably heard this very early in life in Bible class somewhere when you were a kid. And it's kind of easy to lose sight of what this means. If you were a kid and you were in the bathroom and you knocked a can of your dad's cologne or your mom's perfume off the counter and it broke on the floor, first of all, that room would smell great forever. But you probably wouldn't think that much of it. Even if it was an expensive thing, if they really cared that much about it, they would just go buy another one at some point. This is a huge expense in this day and time, far beyond anything you could imagine really spending in one sitting. And this woman takes this perfume and anoints Jesus with it. Now, we learn from John that this woman is Mary. And most people are in agreement. It's always confusing in the New Testament because there's so many Marys running around. Most people are in agreement this is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. And we learn this in John 12, where it happens. And if you will remember, what happened in John 11? We know our favorite memory verse from John 11:35, Jesus wept. We can remember that one. Why was Jesus weeping? The death of Lazarus. And what does Jesus do at the end of that chapter? He raises Lazarus, the brother of Mary, from the dead. And then chapter 12 begins with this. Here is Mary not just showing a love and appreciation for Jesus, but for this one who has brought her brother back from the dead. What would you do if someone you cared about and loved, if Jesus were walking the earth today, came into your town and sat with you and wept with you and talked with you, and then went out to the graveyard and spoke words, and that loved one of yours came up out of the grave and walked back over to you? Could you even have words for how thankful you would be for that? For how appreciative you would be for that? For however many more days you would have with that loved one of yours? And this is what Jesus did. And so Mary she pours out this love for Jesus. And I would like to think that if we were in the room as this happened, as much as it would be amazing for it to happen to your family, if you watched it happen to someone else, just taking all that in. There was a death last week in our country. I don't know if you've heard of this guy's name. This guy's Dick Hoyt is his name. And you may have heard the story somewhere along the way, but Dick Hoyt has a son who is physically challenged, and he has been in a wheelchair his entire life. He communicates somewhat, but in a difficult kind of way. He's not able to do for himself. And there was a time where Dick Hoyt took this son of his who was in a wheelchair, and he took him on a little running race. And he found out in the midst of that his son said to him, he feels not handicapped in that moment. His son, who has always lived in this wheelchair, always felt limited, always not quite sure what to do, he felt very free and alive and just completely normal in the eyes of the world in that moment. And so from that day on, Dick Hoyt's life changed. And Dick Hoyt became a runner in that day. And he started going to event after event after event with his son, well into adulthood for his son. And he would run in half marathons, and then in marathons, and then in triathlons. He would do the swimming part of the triathlon with a rope tied around him to his son, who was in an inflatable boat. And he would drag him through the waters of these triathlons, and his son would feel alive. It's an amazing story to think of what this father has done. And as he died last week, so many people have wondered who's going to carry on the torch so his son can still feel that. Just being around that. There are all these people who took those marathons seriously and were trying to win them. But in the moment you witness these people, you witness an incredible love that I cannot imagine even for a second being critical of. You'd just be so excited to have seen it, to have met these people. And yet in the very next verse, what we find out is that there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was this ointment wasted like that? What a waste. There's so much money that has gone into this fine-smelling ointment. Why would she do that? You could have sold this and given to the poor. And we also learn in other Gospels, Mark is kind, he doesn't name names. And yet in other Gospels we learn Judas is amongst this. And Judas clearly is not the most well-meaning person in the group. And yet Judas criticizes. And so in the midst of this incredible love, you have on the other side a moment of criticism. There's this divergence of attitude here of, on the one side, something that is so good and so pure and so loving, and on the other side, what people tend to do of just raining on that parade. There are a lot of diverging paths throughout this chapter. And I would encourage you, by the way, because we don't have time to read the entire chapter here this morning, sometime this week, maybe this afternoon, go through and read Mark 14 and see how all these different paths diverge, where there is a good and a bad and a positive and a negative, and you will see all these things happening in different ways, and they all tell us something. And here in the midst of the beginning of this story, we see that we could just appreciate the good that happens, or we can criticize for whatever our motive may be. And yet Jesus says, it's okay what she's doing. Don't criticize what she's doing. It's all right, because it's this incredible love that's being shown. Moving down to verse 10, it says that Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. So we're setting up this time where there's going to be a betrayal. And to really be a betrayal, there has to be someone who is close by to Jesus. There are so many out there who want him killed, who want to see an end to all this. But when one of those closest to him begins to turn, it's such a horrible part of the story, such an uncomfortable part. You think of all the years that have gone into Judas at this point. All of the times that he has been there to witness miracles that we would love to have seen. All of the times he's been able to ask questions to the one who created all of us. All of the incredible teachings he's heard, all of the experiences he's had, all of the same things these other 11 men who will continue to follow, all the same things that they see, and yet in him there is something that begins to turn. And it's the thing that makes the religious leaders glad. How painful is that? Here in this time of remembrance of deliverance, all surrounding the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the thing that makes them happy is the opportunity to pull one of his to their side and to begin what they feel like this road to end his life. Verse 12, it says, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And so in the midst of the Passover, we have this remembrance of the lamb. And you will remember back to Exodus, the story where all of these plagues come along, and there are times where it seems like Pharaoh is going to begin to turn, and then he changes his mind, and he's going to begin and free the people, and then he doesn't. There are times where we read that Pharaoh's heart was hard. There are times throughout that we read where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then through all of the plagues and the gnats and the flies and the darkness and the boils and all of these things, we finally lead up to the last one, where the firstborn throughout the land will be killed. And God has provided a way of escape for his people. And they are to go out and they are to kill a lamb, and they are to take the blood of that lamb and put it over their doorpost. And then when death comes into the town and to the land, it will pass over those places. And then from that point on, they will celebrate and remember this Passover that happened through the killing of the Passover lamb, through this feast that happens. Jesus, getting ready to celebrate this with his own disciples, knows all of this story and knows where all of this came from and was there with God as all of this is created and all of these remembrances are made. And Jesus himself is that lamb. John introduces him. He says that when he saw Jesus coming, he says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In John 1:29, John the Baptist says this. Jesus is the Lamb. He is the Lamb of God. And so now the lamb that they have come to celebrate, it's a whole new lamb they're going to celebrate. It says in the midst of that, what we celebrated here a little while ago. The Passover that has been celebrated for all of these hundreds of years, for generations, will now begin to change into something different. And then each week we get together and we take the bread and we take the fruit of the vine and we celebrate the Lamb that has come for us. And we have that same danger, by the way, of losing focus. All of these people who are gathered here for the purpose of remembering their deliverance, and instead all of these schemes are going on in the midst of it. It's easy for us to come here and forget why we're here. And yet the Lamb who has come to deliver us is the reason why we're here. If I didn't say anything, if I stopped right now, if we only sang a couple songs, as long as we were here for this, we will have come together for the reason that we should have been here. We must always remember the sacrifice that was made for us. Later on down in the chapter, in verse 26, it says, when they had sung a hymn after taking the Lord's Supper together, and I'm cheating here a little bit, by the way, we're moving over the Lord's Supper because for those who are not here on Wednesday nights, we are going through over the next several weeks, we're a couple weeks in now, talking about things we do as the church, and this week we're going to talk about the Lord's Supper. So I get to cover more of Mark 14 without having to take our time here, and so if you want to come be a part of that, I'd encourage you to. And after they did that, after he instituted the Lord's Supper, they went out and they had sung a hymn. They went out to the Mount of Olives. In verse 26, Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. You're all going to be scattered. Now, if I'm going along with Jesus at this point, there are probably a lot of things going through my mind. But I will tell you, if I have made it this far, if I am 3 years in, if I have seen the times where I know people are plotting against him, if I have been there at times where I feel confused and I ask him a question and I feel like even in the answer to the question I'm still kind of confused, there would have been something along during those 3 years that probably would have been the point that it was enough if I was going to leave. But this far in, and he says you're going to be scattered, there's a part of me that's mildly offended. There's a part of me that's probably hurt. And there's probably a big part of me that just says, no, we're not going to do that. Look how we've hung with you through all of this. Even when we don't understand what's going on, we're here. Even when you send us out on our own and we don't feel like we're ready, we're here. Even when we see people that are just so angry and upset at you, we're still here. But he says, no, you'll be scattered. Peter said to him, and I like Peter because he's the one who speaks up, what everybody is probably thinking, says, even though they all fall away, I will not. And at the same time, if I'm the rest of the apostles, and Peter says, even if they all fall away, hang on a second, Peter, that's not what we're looking for. Even if they all fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. And wouldn't we all? Not me, Jesus. Even if it's Peter, even if it's John, even if it's one of those other guys, not me. I will not walk away. How many Christians do you suppose have felt that or thought that over the course of the years? How many people that used to sit here, and I'm not talking about people that are not here because of COVID and all of those kinds, I'm talking about people who years ago sat here, and you wonder, what happened to them? People in your own life that you just saw them turn in an awful directions. And how many times do we see that in our world? How many of them at some point in life or at many points in life have thought, not me. Maybe all these other people are going to mess up. Maybe they're all going to fall back into sin. Not me. I think when we hear the words of Jesus here, it's easy for us to look at Judas and know what he's about to do. It's easy for us to look at Peter and be frustrated with him for what he will do in this chapter, but even still understand what he will do later on in the book of Acts. But let's not forget, it could very easily be you or me. We could very easily start moving in the wrong direction, rationalizing our way through all of the things we want, and find ourselves in a place that we never intended to go because we just begin with a few small steps. Not me, Jesus, but it could be. It could be any one of us. They went to a place called Gethsemane in verse 32. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will. I don't want us to underestimate what Jesus is feeling here. Think of the verses we just read, the words that describe it. Greatly distressed and troubled, very sorrowful, even to death. The depth of what he's feeling. How do we explain that? I know we understand what's going to happen. I know we understand what he's going to go through, but the way he words it is to let this cup pass. What is he talking about? I've heard sermons on this. I've heard classes about this. I've heard explanations of this. And I will have to admit to you, too, I became a Christian when I was 13. I have shifted in my mind since then lots of times about exactly what he's talking about here. And several times along there, I've thought I am exactly right now about where I am on this, and then I've changed my mind later about what it means. I think it can mean a lot of things. I think it could have to do with the pain, and maybe that's where we begin. The idea of, think of the pain he is about to endure. Maybe you have heard sermons all about the medical side of the crucifixion and what that would be like, all of the flogging and the beating and all of that he went through. And yes, clearly there was a lot of pain involved in this. It's interesting how the last part of the Gospels works compared to other biographies of that day and time. If you were to look at biographies of Greek heroes or of Egyptian heroes, other heroes of cultures of that time, you would see things about the heroic things they did. You might see things about the sacrifice they made through their giving of their lives. You would probably hear them talk about their defiance or their bravery or things along those lines. What you would not find is what we just read. You would not find the weakness. You would not find the moment where someone who is so defiant and set on what they are going to do that it comes to death or comes to torture. You would not find a moment where they talk about the weakness that they have leading in. And that continues on through history, by the way. You remember watching Braveheart several years ago? A lot of us have probably seen that. You didn't see a lot of weakness in William Wallace there at the end. You saw defiance and bravery and all of those things. And here in Jesus, we see something very different. And by the way, notice, he goes off by himself. What do the apostles that went with him do? They fall asleep. There is not a witness to this. This part of the story did not have to be told. And yet when the Spirit brings it on the writers of the Gospels to tell the story, here it is. Could it be the pain? It could be. I think we sell this short if we just stop there. I'm sure the pain probably plays a role. Could it be death? Could it be the fact that even if you knew you had to go through an incredible torture, as long as you would be alive on the other side of it, then you could survive and get out to the other side? I saw a thing online the other day about an older woman who had the number on her arm. And it had an A in that number because she had been to Auschwitz. And that symbolized that. Could you imagine what this woman experienced in life? But she did come out on the other side and carried on with life. Maybe for him, part of this cup is pain. Maybe part of it is death. The fact that even knowing he can rise again, that moment of death has a finality to it. Maybe this idea of loneliness. We talked about that a week or two ago. Here is someone who has been in community for all of time. He is in the beginning with God, John tells us. And so for someone who has always been in the presence of God and been in the presence of people as he has been in life, in this moment of the cross, he will be fully alone. Maybe it's that. I believe a big piece of it is the wrath of God. We don't like to talk about the wrath of God. We struggle with the idea of the wrath of God sometimes, maybe less in church. I will tell you our world, one of the biggest struggles in our world when it comes to the idea of God as he is taught about in Scripture is the wrath of God. Because what they want is a God who loves. When I was a sophomore at Harding, we had to take a Bible course where it was non-Bible majors. It was just people from all kinds of different parts of campus. And the professor one day got up and said, God is blank. And he wanted us to fill in the blank. And he started going one by one around the room asking people. And there was all kinds of stuff. Somebody got love really fast. And all the other good qualities of God. Took a while before anybody got to anything remotely like wrath. We don't like to think of an angry, wrathful kind of God. But the struggle is if God was only love, if God was all love all the time, regardless of what anybody was doing or what was going on, would you ever truly know if you were loved by God? But a God who has wrath, a God who has justice, a God who has some anger about him, who demands payment for sin, who has created a plan where the payment for sin is something that is so dear to him. What would you sacrifice your children for? Nothing, right? We have a son who's celebrating a birthday today. I remember that day vividly. And from that point forward, the idea of sacrificing one of my children for anything, no way. No way. And God sacrifices his son to appease the wrath because of his love for us. Why do I believe it's the wrath part of what we see here in the cup? Because when you look at the cup throughout the Old Testament, it seems to point that way quite a bit. Look all the way back to Job. In Job 21, verses 19 and 20, it says, God stores up the punishment of the wicked for their children. Let him repay the wicked so that they themselves will experience it. Let their own eyes see their destruction and let them drink the cup of wrath of the Almighty. And I picked out one, but there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch about the wrath of God when it comes to that cup. Within the book of Job, within the prophets, all the way down to Revelation, we will find the cup of the wrath of God. Jesus, he is not sorrowful at the level he is. He is not near to the point of death. He is not, as we read in other places, sweating drops of blood. He is not with this intensity of emotion just because of the pain, just because of the loneliness, just because of death. He is going to take on the entire wrath of God that we deserve. And he knows that is coming. And as much as the wrath of God may be on one person, what would the entire world worth of wrath of God feel like on one person? What he is going to experience for us is completely, it's unexplainable. It's the reason why we have words like cup and the intensity of emotion that he has. It's so hard to put into words. And immediately, while he was still speaking, still in the midst of the things he would say to his disciples after this prayer, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd of swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. It is this time of just complete chaos. I know they may seem organized on the surface because you've got Judas and you've got what feels like military folk and all of that stuff, and that seems like order. This is chaos. Because there is something about pinpoint fighting. You know what is not pinpoint fighting? The way we look at fighting wars nowadays, and you see video of crosshairs and laser-guided things and all of that stuff. A group of men with clubs, that is chaos. There is no aim with that. You just start swinging. Hope you catch something important so you can take somebody down. And in this moment where everything is together, then suddenly everything becomes chaotic again. When God creates the world, what does he do? He takes chaos and he brings it into order. When God's plan culminates here with Jesus, what happens? Everything that was order is becoming chaotic again. And there is going to be this time where it is not an orderly takeaway. It is not Jesus turning himself in to be taken into custody. Everything is chaotic first. As people come in with their clubs, one of Jesus' people, Peter, we find out, is going to take his sword and strike somebody else. And there is a moment where it could just turn into a melee. And even Jesus brings order to that. He says, no, I'll go. I don't know why you're coming in this way, because I'll go with you. And they all left him and fled. At the end, as Jesus is taken into custody, it says in verse 50, they all left and fled, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. They all left. What did he say was going to happen? They're all going to scatter. What did they say? Not me. Maybe those guys. Not me. What do? They all left. And here in the moment where Jesus had this intensity about the suffering and the pain that would be happening, about the cup that he would have to deal with, he is left to deal with it alone. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. They're all together there to do their job, and he is alone in their midst. What Jesus went through for us, it is so easy just to put it into that one moment that we celebrate each week. So much more than that. What he went through in coming to the earth and leaving heaven behind, a place that we can't even begin to describe. It's tried in Scripture, streets of gold and all of those things. I don't know about you. I don't anticipate actually seeing streets that are gold. Maybe that's literal, I don't know. I think it's something that's given there to help us understand this is something incredible that we can't completely comprehend. If there's gold streets, I'm good with that too, whichever way it goes. He left all of that for us. But he didn't leave all of that for us to come to a place where he was fully understood and where everything would go smoothly and go well. He left it for a life that will become chaos in the end. A God who values and loves order was willing to take on again chaos that he had repaired. And he was willing to take on the wrath of God for us. And that should leave us like these folks who celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread every year, unable to forget what has happened for us. Unable to forget between now and the next time we come here on Sunday to do this again, to forget the sacrifice that is made for us. And thankful forever to know that it is because of the love of God for us that we could have that. This morning, if you don't know that love of God, if you've looked at God and thought, he seems wrathful and angry in the Old Testament, and I'm not quite sure what I think about that. If you're watching online and you think that about God, know that there is much more to God than wrath and anger. God really is love, but it's only because of that justice and that wrath of God that we can see what that love really looks like. God's love for you wants you to come to him, to be baptized into him, to walk a new life today. God's love also, if you have followed him in the past, wants you to come back. God is never satisfied to see his people walk away. He wants them to return and to be with him again. So if you have fallen from him, you can come back today. Or if there's something we can do as your church family, God also intends that we not be alone. God intends for us to walk this road together. And if we can help you in some way, please come while we stand and sing.